Now, what was it that caused Charles Darwin to propose this preposterous theory of evolution? He noticed that there was different types of finches. You know the finches from the Galapagos? That was the thing that he noticed, the different types of finches which had different beak shapes, 18 in total. He noticed 18 different types of finches. And this is what caused him to believe in this theory that he proposed of evolution and that these things evolved. Now, what he noticed was something called microevolution. In other words, all these finches that he saw, they were different types of finches, but they were all finches. And they would only ever give birth to finches. They wouldn't give birth to something which is not a finch. That is called microevolution, the variation of species within a kind of animal. So you have different types of dogs, many different types of dogs. I don't know how many breeds of dogs there are, but there's many, isn't there? There's 45,000 different species of spider, but they're all spiders. So these things can evolve, I object to the term, but I'll use it just for simplicity. These things can evolve within their own kind. You can get different types of, different types of horses. There's different types of bears. Now, the thing is, if you take a black bear, for example, it has black fur. If you go up to the north of Canada, where my wife's from, you'll find polar bears. But if you go into the middle of their fur and just dig a bit, they have black skin. They're no different to a regular bear. They've adapted to their environment. That's called microevolution. These things do evolve and they do adapt into their own environment. But the point is that DNA does not cross genetic barriers. In other words, this bear will never become something different than a bear. It will always be a bear and it will always give birth to bears, whether that's a polar bear or a grizzly bear or whatever. Did you know that you can actually breed a lion and a tiger together? They actually call it a liger. That is genetically possible. It's difficult, but there are animals have been bred that are a hybrid of lion and tiger. Why? Because they're both part of the cat family. They're both cats. You can also breed a zebra with a donkey. Very difficult again, but it's possible. You can do it because they are both part of the horse family. You can also breed a wolf and a coyote because they are both part of the dog family. Now, again, you can't breed one kind of animal with a different kind of animal. Why? Because DNA will not cross the genetic barriers. So this is what is called microevolution. These things can vary within the kind of animal that they are, different species of one kind of animal, but you can't change one kind of animal to another. Now, a good example of this is that you have different types of fish, but there's two primary types of fish, and that is freshwater fish and saltwater fish. A saltwater fish cannot survive in freshwater, and a freshwater fish cannot survive in saltwater. There's a guy called David Clifton from Alabama who did an experiment in 2004 with black molly fish. Black molly fish are freshwater fish, and what he did was he gradually added to the aquarium levels of salt over 2 weeks, and after 2 weeks, the level of salt within the water had become the same level as that in the ocean. And these fish had now adapted themselves within 2 weeks from freshwater fish to saltwater fish over a gradual 2-week period. They had become saltwater fish. What do you think happened when he put the same fish back into fresh water? They died within half an hour. Within 2 weeks, it became a saltwater fish. 2 weeks, that's how long it took. Microevolution. That's a classic example of microevolution. Then you have something called macroevolution. Macroevolution is the change from one kind of animal to another. Now, of course, they will say that it takes a lot longer, a very, very long period of time. Well, it is a very long period of time. You know how long it is? It doesn't even happen. That's how long it takes. It doesn't even happen. Microevolution is a fallacy. The definition of science is something that you can observe, test, and demonstrate through experimentation. The Science Council definition of science is this: science is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. Based on evidence. Is there any evidence for macroevolution? Well, you've all seen that picture, haven't you, of the evolution chart where you have a monkey which starts and then it grows up into a full human man. You've all seen that chart, haven't you? Well, we'd expect to see many transitional forms. These things are called transitional forms. When it gradually goes through that scale, it's a transitional form. And of course, if it happened over millions of years, as it is said to have done, if it happens over millions of years, then we would expect to find trillions and trillions of these so-called transitional forms. Now, I want to introduce you to a guy called Dr. Colin Patterson. Dr. Colin Patterson is the director and senior paleontologist of the London Natural History Museum. In other words, you can't get a less biased source than this. Dr. Colin Patterson, director and senior paleontologist of the London Natural History Museum. Now, he wrote this book about evolution, and he receives a letter from this guy called Luther Sutherland in 1979. Luther Sutherland objects to the fact that in his book he doesn't include any examples of transitional forms. This is Colin Patterson's response to Luther Sutherland. This is a quote from his letter. "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument." We have here the senior paleontologist of the London Natural History Museum admitting here that there is not one example of a transitional form which will make a scientific argument. In other words, evidence. There is not one. Remember, this should have happened over millions of years. If it happened over millions of years, we should be finding them everywhere. We should be tripping over them. Not one has ever been found of an example. They say about the gaps in the fossil records. Evolutionists will admit that there are gaps in the fossil records. That is understatement of the century. It's not gaps, it's non-existent. There are no examples in the fossil records of transitional forms from monkey to man. So in other words, that first one that you see on that chart, the monkey, we found millions of those, millions of them. The human, at the end there, we found millions of those. What about all the ones in the middle? None of them. Not one in the middle has been found. Now, this is one of the things that Darwin himself admitted in his book, Origin of Species. Origin of Species is that book that he wrote, which is obviously what his theory is based on. In chapter 6 of this book, this is the chapter that he dedicates to all the problems that there are with the theory. He even says that this theory has so many problems, and this is what we should be finding in order for this theory to stand up. So again, in chapter 6 of Origin of Species, this is what Darwin says. But, as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Darwin here answers his own question. Because it never happened, because they never existed. There's no such thing as these transitional forms. I can, however, show you examples of frauds that have taken place. There are many, many fraudulent fabrications of these so-called transitional forms. For example, you've all heard of Neanderthal man, haven't you? Neanderthal man. Well, in 1958, they concluded that that was nothing more than a very, very aged man with arthritis. Nothing to do with half monkey, half man. In 1958, they concluded this. Why is it still in the textbooks? Why is it still in the school textbooks? They've already concluded that is nothing more than an old man with arthritis. Piltdown man. Who's heard of Piltdown man? This is probably the biggest fraudulent example of a transitional form. Now, some of these are not always deliberate frauds. Sometimes they're just misunderstandings or accidents, but there are deliberate frauds and fabrications. These evolutionists will go at all lengths to disprove the Bible and to prove this theory which has no evidence. So Piltdown man, this was the skull of a human being combined with the jaw of an orangutan. They actually put these two together, and they also filed down the teeth to make them look animal-like. A deliberate fabrication, a deliberate fraud. Again, when this Piltdown man was discovered, it went straight in the scientific textbooks. Piltdown man, one of the missing links between man and monkey. It went straight into the textbooks. And it's still there today. And we know that it's a fraud, a fabrication. And yet they still teach it as science. Java man. Who's heard of Java man? Java man was nothing more than a skull cap and a femur bone. That is all that is Java man, a skull cap and a femur bone. What they don't tell you is that the skull cap and the femur bone were found 50 feet apart from each other. Not even the same animal or human, whatever we're going to call it. Not even the same one. It's found 50 feet away from each other. Nebraska man. Who's heard of Nebraska man? Nebraska man is the tooth of an extinct pig. One tooth is what they based it on. One tooth turned out to be an extinct pig. And again, they want to call this science. The reason that they come back with these fraudulent fabrications is because when these evolutionists and scientists go out on these expeditions, they get given grant money. What happens when they come back with nothing? No more grant money. Who's going to give them who's going to give them money now to go out on these archaeology digs? No one's going to. They need the evidence, otherwise they run out of grant money. So if there's no evidence, let's make some up. That's exactly, I'm not exaggerating here, brothers and sisters. This is exactly what they've done. They've made up evidence. It's proven that it's been frauds, and yet it still gets taught as science. Now, we live in a free country. You're free to believe whatever you want. You live in a democracy where you have freedom of belief. If you want to believe that man evolved from monkey, believe it. You have the freedom to do that, but don't call it science. Don't call it science. Science is based on evidence, and there is none. People say, but what about cavemen? Cavemen. I thought that was all part of the evolutionary theory. Don't think about this too much. What is a caveman? Clever people. A caveman is a man who lives in a cave. There is no link between man and monkey. It's a man who lives in a cave. A 5-year-old child can tell you that. A man who lives in a cave. There's an example in the Bible of men living in caves, isn't there?